These are 10 unexpected draft stars in Secrets of Strixhaven. Now, unexpected is from my point of view, but when I first read these cards, I thought they were either underpowered or would only fit into niche strategies and be good there, but not good in general. Instead, these cards are great and are ones you want to actively prioritize for your decks. First up is Exhibition Tidecaller. For a single blue mana, you get a 0/2 Djinn Wizard at rare. It has Opus. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, target player mills 3 cards. If 5 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, that player mills 10 cards instead. Now, the reason it was easy to underrate this card is because mill is not a supported archetype in this format. And if you don't fully mill out your opponent, it generally is more helpful to them than harmful, because if they still have cards in their deck, you're not beating them. And if they have flashback spells, which you mill over, they get free value. Or if they have cards that, for example, return creatures from their graveyard to their hand, then they get more selection when you mill them. So it's really a downside to mill your opponent unless you're going to mill them out all the way. And Exhibition Tidecaller actually can do that more effectively than I first thought. The fact that you can play Exhibition Tidecaller on turn 6 alongside a 5 mana play to mill them for 10 immediately, and then the following turn threaten to untap and mill them for 10 again, really is a play pattern that isn't well supported in every format, because not every format gives you the time to kind of generate like this kind of slow game plan where you're going to have a card like a 1 mana 0/2 that doesn't affect the board state, that just sits in your hand for a while. A lot of formats, you need to have cards that are actively blocking, actively doing stuff in combat, because your opponent is able to pressure you effectively. And even though this format does have assertive decks, there are tools to combat those decks to the point where you can slow the game down enough to have Exhibition Tidecaller be an effective win con, or at least an effective threat that your opponent then has to scramble to answer, where you play Tidecaller, immediately play a big spell, following turn untap and play another big spell, mill them for 20. And once you've milled them for 20, you generally don't have to survive that much longer in order to be able to win the game. And so Exhibition Tidecaller ends up being a really strong card in blue control mirrors, and not as big of a liability as it would be in other formats in the faster matchups. And so it ends up being a very effective card and one you want to prioritize. Next up is Tome Blast. It's 1 and a red for a common sorcery. It says Tome Blast deals 2 damage to any target. And then it has flashback for 4 and a red. Now, generally with a flashback spell, you're looking for a card that does an effective thing as a base rate, because if you end up having to play an ineffective card and then wait for the late game and play another like slightly underpowered card, sometimes you fall too far behind with the first mode of the card to really be able to leverage getting to flash it back. Now, sometimes 2 mana deal 2 is a way that can answer like enough creatures, but it's generally a bit underpowered from what you would want for a 2 mana removal spell. We often see like 2 mana deal 3s or things of that nature. And so 2 mana deal 2 feels like a weak enough spell, especially at sorcery speed, that Tome Blast looked a lot weaker than it's ended up playing out. It gets a lot better because of the fact that it synergizes really effectively with the 2 main red decks in the format, which was something that could be predicted before the format started, but being able to flash back does help with red-white, because red-white cares about cards leaving the graveyard, and being able to cast it for 5 mana with flashback does work with Opus spells and help you trigger those big Opus effects. And those both are good like reasons to like bump Tome Blast up a little bit, but it did remain to be seen how effective a 2 mana deal 2 would be at answering the threats that you cared about answering. And it turns out that there are enough cards you can answer for 2 damage that Tome Blast ends up being an effective enough card on the front side and really nice to flashback, and overall ends up being a really good card as a result, when in some formats it would be a little bit clunky or maybe not line up as well. But in this format, it's a good card and one you should prioritize. Next up is Practiced Offense. For 2 and a white, it's a sorcery that says put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. Target creature gains your choice of Double Strike or Lifelink until end of turn, and then flashback for 1 and a white. Now, this card is easy to underrate, because if you are on the back foot, you like often think of the downside of a card. If you don't have any creatures in play, it does nothing. If you only have like 1 creature in play, it's still not that great. And so once you start getting up to like 2 or 3 creatures in play, where you can like buff up both your creatures, give them Double Strike, or buff up your whole team, give a couple creatures Double Strike, give something Double Strike and Lifelink. Generally doing this in the same turn is pretty effective, because Double Strike plus Lifelink can be a big swing, or spreading it out if you don't have the mana. But just being able to have like 3 or 4 creatures in play when you cast Practiced Offense makes a big difference compared to casting this if you're on the defensive and don't have any creatures in play. So it's easy to see this card and think, oh, if I already have a bunch of creatures in play, things are going well for me, and so I don't need a card that helps me win more. But it turns out that a lot of the white decks are the aggressive decks in the format. They want to be assertive. They're putting the pressure on their opponents, and this card just ends the game almost instantly when you cast it. And if you're already behind in your white decks, you're generally going to be losing anyway, and like having a random 3/3 creature in this slot wouldn't like save you in the games that you were losing. But the games that are kind of close, this just puts it over the top, puts it out of reach. Anytime, like it removes any chance of your opponent coming back, and just lets you really leverage the fact that if you can get a few creatures in play, which white decks are able to do in this format, then you're able to just absolutely clobber your opponent. So this card ends up being incredibly effective, just wins you so many games, just adds so much stats to the board, does so much damage, and is a really effective card. When in some formats where white maybe had like its best deck being a blue-white control deck, this might not be as good in like a slower deck that's more reliant on blocking. And so just because both of the red-white and black-white tend to be like pushing the pace, trying to end the game, Practiced Offense ends up being an absolutely stellar card and one you should really be actively prioritizing. Next up is Rebel Rouser. For 2 and a red, it's a 1/4 dwarf sorcerer that says when this creature enters, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card, and then tap, exile a card from your graveyard, add red mana. When you do this, creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. Now, as a random common, being a 3 mana 1/4 isn't always the best stat line, but this just does so much for the red-white deck and isn't terrible in the blue-red deck either that it ends up being a really effective card. So in a red-white deck, this just ramps up your mana. It helps you fill your graveyard a little bit by letting you rummage. And it's going to be dealing 1 damage to your opponent while triggering your cards that care about things leaving the graveyard without you having to spend extra mana and resources on them. You just have to have enough cards in your graveyard to fuel it. Where the difference between having this card in play and not having it in play means that any card that you have that cares about leaving the graveyard, maybe it gets a +1/+1 counter, maybe it'll generate you a 2/2 when something leaves the graveyard. This thing just lets you fuel all of those and wild pinging your opponent and basically being like a 1 mana, like a 1-powered unblockable creature that's also adding you mana and also synergizing with your other cards. It ends up being absolutely like very powerful in the red-white decks, a card you should actively prioritize when if you're just looking at the stat lines and think, oh, 3 mana 1/4, maybe that's not what I want. It is what you want in this format. It plays really, really well in the red-white deck. It's okay in the blue-red deck, as I said, but it's much, much better in red-white. And red-white being such a good deck in this format does mean that this card ends up playing out really well as a result. Next up is Mathemagics. It's XX blue for a sorcery at Mythic Rare. It says target player draws 2 to the X card. So if you spend 0 mana, just blue on it for the X, you get to make target player draw 1 card. If you spend X equals 1, target player draws 2 cards. So 4 mana, draw 2. You can spend 2 mana to make someone draw 4. So 6 mana, draw 4. And if you just look at the way this card phrases out, generally you're getting a relatively inefficient rate at like all of the amounts of mana you're spending. 2 mana to draw 1 isn't good. 4 mana to draw 2 isn't good. Once you get up to 6 mana, draw 4, it gets a little bit better. 8 mana, draw 8 ends up being like really effective generally. But a lot of the times, if you're playing a draft format, you don't have time to be casting these expensive card draw spells that don't affect the board state and are things like, okay, I spend 8 mana to draw 8 cards, then my opponent just has 4 creatures in play and just kills me because I've just not done anything with my 8 mana. What ends up happening with Mathemagic is not only can you use it as a card draw spell, but it ends up being a win condition where you just have this card in your hand. You eventually get to 10 mana. You cast this for like X equals 4. Make your opponent draw 16 cards, or you just wait a couple more turns, have a couple treasure tokens maybe in play to help you like get that extra mana, and then you cast it for X equals 5 and make them draw 32 and the game is just over. And so having this kind of like I win button, especially for the slower matchups, if you're playing a grindy mirror match and it's just like, okay, I have Mathemagics in my deck, eventually we'll both have 10 mana in play. If I can just survive until that point, play Mathemagics, like make them draw 32 cards or whatever, I'll just win the game. And so just this like I win button version of Mathemagics isn't something that's going to be supported in every format. A lot of formats are quicker than the sort of format that allows you to just wait until you have X equals 5 to just win the game with this, or where spending 8 mana to draw 8 cards would be like an effective use of your mana at that stage of the game where you're not just going to like be destroyed on the backswing when your opponent just kills you with their like random flyers they have at that point in the game. So the fact that this format does support some slower gameplay makes Mathemagics a lot better, and it's actually a very potent win condition, a very strong card, and one you should be really, really going after if you see it. You should be pretty much taking this card like as very, very often when you see this card in packs, because it's just a really, really effective win condition, and like you aren't as punished for the slow card draw version of the card as well. Next up is Divergent Equation, another card in a very similar boat. It's XX blue. For an instant, return up to X target instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand, exile Divergent Equation. So if you're spending this for X equals 2, getting back 2 instants or sorceries isn't generally the best use of your mana. 5 mana, you're getting back 2 spells. That can still be good enough in some situations, but generally you want to be using this for X equals 3, and a lot of formats you don't have time to spend X equals 3 to spend like 7 mana on a card that doesn't affect the board state and is just getting back cards from your graveyard. But in this format, you can spend X equals 3 a decent amount of the time, get back 3 spells, and basically just have 3 more action spells than your opponent at that point in the game, take over the game, and just have a really effective control finisher at uncommon. So Divergent Equation ends up being really effective. You have plenty of time to use it. And even though I've mentioned this a bunch of times, there are these aggressive decks in the format, but there's also plenty of tools to fight them. And you are going to find yourself in spots where you're just playing the slow deck mirror match and you need something to help you go over the top. And Divergent Equation helps you do that. Where if you're playing a slow mirror match, you spend Divergent Equation for X equals 3, get back like 2 card draw spells and a removal spell. And all of a sudden your opponent's scrambling because they just like are just getting so outvalued. And so this ends up being a really effective card, even though it does look kind of clunky. And there are some formats where this would just be the sort of spell where you cast it, get back those instants and sorceries, and then lose the game the following turn. It doesn't end up being like that in Secrets of Strixhaven. Next up is Pursue the Past. For red, white, you get a sorcery at common. It says you gain 2 life. You may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. And then it has flashback for 2 red, white. This has been one of the most surprising commons in the format. It doesn't look like that much of a spell when you first read it, because generally these sorts of rummage cards aren't that effective. Now, sure, red, white does care about graveyard stuff, and so having a flashback spell is useful for cards that care about things leaving the graveyard. Maybe discarding a thing can put another flashback spell into your graveyard, so that can be effective. But the way this ends up playing out is that you end up using the flashback to actually get stats on board a lot of the time, be that +1/+1 counters or generating like a 2/2 or something like that from some other trigger you have that cares about something leaving the graveyard. And another really nice aspect of this card is that when you do flash it back, you're getting like card advantage actually. So what this ends up being if you spend both modes of the card is the first time you spend Pursue from the Past and you discard a card and you draw 2 cards. So you don't go up a card in that scenario. But when you flash it back from your graveyard, you end up using Pursue the Past from your graveyard. So it's not a card from your hand. You discard 1 card from your hand and draw 2. So you end up a card at the end of the day. So it gives you a little bit of card advantage, which these cards typically end up card parity instead of card advantage. And the life gain can be surprisingly effective, especially if you are playing in those faster matchups where this can enable you to actually use the value that you're getting from the card because you're gaining some life. And just there are those incremental burn cards. There's the 1/4 we looked at that when it taps, it deals 1 damage to the opponent. Having a little bit of life gain here and there can really help offset the damage that you're taking from random incidental stuff like that. Buy you the extra time you need to stabilize the game, win the game with value as well. And Pursue the Past ends up being a really key card for red-white decks, really strong in that shell because it does what you want to do for the more mid-rangey versions of that deck, especially where you want to build up your graveyard resources, have things leave the graveyard, find your synergy pieces so that you can kind of assemble these mini combos, and Pursue the Past helps you do that. Next up is Arcane Omens. For 4 and a black, you get a sorcery that says Converge, target player discards X cards, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. This card is really bad if you just use it for 2 colors. So if you're playing a typical black-white deck or a typical black-green deck that's not splashing, Arcane Omens would be a horrific card that you would never want to play. However, as we've mentioned many times, this format does lend itself to these late-game mirror matches. There are plenty of value plays you can do. Even the red-white decks are sometimes trying to grind into the late game and making your opponent discard 3, 4, or sometimes even 5 cards if you're fully enabling Arcane Omens can be absolutely devastating. And so a card that looks very niche or very much so like, okay, if I'm playing a multicolor deck, maybe I'll put Arcane Omens in there, ends up being a card that's much more effective of, oh, if I'm playing a blue-red deck and I'm splashing a black removal spell, maybe I'll also splash an Arcane Omens. And it actually ends up being almost more effective in a blue-red deck that's splashing it than in like a deck that is base black that's just playing a 2-color deck. It ends up being much more effective in these decks that are splashing. And so unless you are splashing, you have no interest in Arcane Omens. But once you start getting the ability to generate 3 or 4 colors of mana in your deck, it ends up being a much more appealing card, and one that can absolutely break the game wide open in a mirror match in the slow matches where you just make your opponent discard 4 cards and the game just feels over for them. And that's the sort of thing that Arcane Omens can do, where on the surface it looks like the sort of thing as well where sometimes you'll make your opponent discard a couple cards and then they just like swing back on and kill you with the creatures they've been playing while they've been affecting the board state and you've been casting random discard spells. So again, the fact that the format has this unique nature to it where there are plenty of these late game mirror matches does make Arcane Omens a lot better. In a similar boat, Snarl Song, 5 and a green for a sorcery, converge, create 2/0/0 green and blue fractal creature tokens, put X +1/+1 counters on each of them, and you gain X life, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. This is a card that when I first read it, I assumed it was going to be excellent in certain decks, but it ends up just being excellent in a lot of decks that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Like a blue-red deck that sees Snarl Song almost treats it as if, oh, this is a great card for my deck specifically, because blue-red often splashes into these other colors for these converge spells. And so instead of Snarl Song being like, okay, I'm playing a blue-green deck that's also splashing a couple of different colors, a little bit of red for removal, a little bit of black for removal, maybe one white bomb rare. Okay, I'm playing 5 colors. Now I love Snarl Song and this card is excellent. It ends up being like, oh, I see Snarl Song in my very first pack of the draft, pack 1, pick 1. I can first pick this card and know that I can get the support to draft these multicolored decks around it where I'm consistently casting it for 4 colors or 5 colors. And it's just such an effective card where it looks like it's much more niche than it ends up being. It ends up being just an absolutely stellar card in pretty much any deck that has access to green mana because there are so many tools to splash. And against the aggressive decks in particular, it feels almost unbeatable when your opponent gains 5 and puts 2 5/5s into play. And it's just so much easier to cast for the converge cost than it might look at first glance. This card is an absolute monster of a card and one you should really be prioritizing because even though it looks more niche, it actually just fits into pretty much any deck that can cast it. And a lot of the decks that can cast it include decks that aren't even playing its main colors, like a blue-red deck, which is kind of wild. Next up is Brush Off, which is 2 blue for an instant at uncommon. It says this spell costs 1 and a blue less to cast. If it targets an instant or sorcery spell, counter target spell. Now, we've looked at in this video alone tons of fantastic instants and sorceries that just absolutely devastate the game. If you counter a Snarl Song with this, you feel like you did it and you only had to spend 2 mana on it. The fact that you can just spend 2 blue for a counter spell, though, makes this way better than it would otherwise be because you are sometimes going to end up in situations where you just need to counter a big creature. You don't want to be able to only counter instants and sorceries, which would make this more of a sideboard card. But the fact that you can just spend 2 blue, counter any spell that you care about, especially in these late game matchups where we are seeing where there's a lot of these like big threats that come down late in the game, that just makes Brush Off absolutely much better as a card. And there are these sorts of situations where you come up against these slow decks and there's all these cards that go in for the slow decks and then you go up against a fast deck and maybe you lose to the fast deck because you're playing cards like Brush Off that are maybe a little bit slower and geared towards those slow matchups. But there are going to be scenarios even in the fast matchups where you use Brush Off for 2 mana to counter their 4 mana removal spell and you feel like you really made a big swing in the game. And so even these cards that are more geared towards the slow matchups can still find avenues to perform in the fast matchups as well. And this one just ends up performing way better than it looks. It looks like a sideboard card because you don't really want to be spending 4 mana for a counter. But a lot of the times when you get to the late game scenarios, you love having access to this because a lot of the big cards you care about countering are these expensive instants and sorceries. And Brush Off ends up being a really strong card as a result and one that you're happy playing versus a card that you would like sideboard in for the right matchup. You're just going to main deck this card most of the time you have it and you're going to be pretty happy playing it. One final card is a bonus. I've already covered my 10, but I wanted to talk about Together as One as well, because it ends up being one of the best rares in the set, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. Because even though when you read this card, 6 mana sorcery, converge, target player draws X cards, Together as One deals X damage to any target, and you gain X life, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. You read this card and you kind of just think, okay, that's a great card. Even if you cast this for 3 colors, draw 3, gain 3, deal 3 is just great, even though it costs 6 mana. But you end up doing this for 5 colors a large amount of the time. Deal 5, draw 5, gain 5 is insane. And this card, even though it looks like, okay, maybe Converge wouldn't come together all that often, this is just another example of one of those cards where it's like, okay, the Converge deck can just come together very frequently. You can have a 5-color deck. There's like going to be one person in the pod in every draft almost that's trying to draft 4 or 5 colors and making Together as One of the best rares in the set, instead of just the sort of card where it's like, okay, it's a solid rare, but when you have the 5 colors, it's really good. It just ends up being really, really good every single time because there is going to be a player trying to draft those 5 colors. And if you have Together as One, that player is going to be you because it just makes the card so much better. And there are all of these payoffs for making that 5-color deck work. And there's a ton of fixing to help make it happen. And so Together as One, bit of a bonus card here, because I felt like I'd already talked about a lot of these Converge cards that maybe overperformed or were these stars in the format. But Together as One is so much better than maybe the expectation level going into the format of just like, oh, it's a solid card that's going to be great when you have 5 colors, into just, okay, this is great because you're going to have 5 colors a lot of the time that you draft this. I wanted to talk about it as a little bit of a bonus card. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. If you did make it to the end, leave hashtag 10 stars in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.